Let's talk foul play and nefarious deeds on the tabletop, dodgy dice, wrong rules and generous movement, with a roundup of the most common examples of cheating in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking cheating in Warhammer 40K once more. And for this video I thought I'd refresh one of my older ones on the channel, talking a little bit about a bunch of examples of cheating in game, and a few thoughts as to how you might come across them and ways to potentially deal with them if you do. When I'm talking about cheating in Warhammer 40k, I'm talking about deliberately breaking the rules in a way that advantages you in one way or another. I certainly distinguish it from accidentally misplaying in one way or another, which is certainly far more common. 40k is a complicated game with lots going on. Mistakes are going to get made by literally everyone playing, and as with many things in life, you probably shouldn't attribute to malice what could easily be explained by honest mistakes. In my experience, and when I've done polls about it on the channel, deliberate cheating just really isn't common in Warhammer 40k. I feel like whenever it does happen, particularly at publicised events where you've seen someone do something stupid on stream, it gets publicised and talked about quite a lot, but at least in my experience that doesn't tend to be the common reality for people. From one previous poll on the channel, about 60% of people thought that cheating tended to happen in around about 0 to 5% of their games, so 1 in 20 or less, and a big chunk of the remaining thought it happened in 1 in 10 or less. As with most other games, the vast majority of people just wouldn't see the point in cheating. For the ways that most people play Warhammer 40k, it's not like you win anything. If you do happen to have led your model soldiers to victory on the tabletop, it's certainly not like you've out-generaled your opponent either. If you've played fast and loose with the rules, and in general probably the biggest thing it's going to get you is a bad reputation, and people not wanting to play you anymore. Again, from previous polls, it does tend to be something that happens maybe a little bit more in tournaments than casual play, though opinion really seems to be divided on that. When I asked people who regularly attend tournaments and also play casual, 43% of them reckoned that cheating occurs a bit more in tournaments, so a bit more than the percentage of people who think it happens more often in casual play, but still not a majority opinion it would seem. I don't know if there might be a bit of bias there. I guess, as mentioned, if you see something happen at a tournament, it's likely to be widely talked about, so maybe there's a bit of reporting bias. In any case though, in most people's experience, cheating does tend to be kind of rare in 40k, but I think it's still worth being aware of the different ways that it can manifest, a few of which have a lot of overlap with just good sportsmanship in general. Jumping into it and starting with one of the more basic things is making rules errors in 40k. And again, I just underline that the vast majority of mistakes and misplays are going to be innocent mistakes. Warhammer 40k still has an enormous amount of depth and breadth. The designer's commentary document has a ridiculous amount of stuff in it, plus each codex and army has a pretty massive amount of stats and nuance to remember, that it's not practical to check every rule every time you use it. Making accidental errors is definitely not cheating, and everyone does that from time to time. It does mean that there's maybe a little bit of cover though for people who want to make errors in their own favour and see if they're challenged. Perhaps things like forgetting certain small but crucial nuances or disadvantages that might make a rule not quite work in their favour, or just flatly getting a stat line slightly wrong in one way or another, in a way that might be small but important with, say, a saving, or whether a model lives on 1 wound or dies. I feel like you might get some borderline use of this as well, say if a player can't remember whether their gun has an AP of AP1 or AP2. Rather than look it up, they just decide to assume that it's the AP2 for this game. Again, that'd be kind of pushing you into making a lot more errors in your favour as opposed to against you. I feel like this sort of thing is kind of impossible to improve intent one way or the other for any 1 or 2 mistakes, and as a result you kind of need to give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. It's usually the thing that tends to become more and more obvious in hindsight. Say for example, if they're playing an army and make 10 rules errors over the course of the game that all favour them but don't hinder their army in any way, by that kind of point it's starting to look rather deliberate as opposed to just accidental. It really doesn't help too much that Games Workshop keep their rules locked behind codex paywalls, so unless you're going by third-party apps or sites, you can't just check your opponent's rules yourself. You'd often have to ask to check a rule in your opponent's book. There's definitely nothing wrong with doing that, and I certainly would do it if there's a rule or stratagem that seems very off. It's definitely not an unreasonable request, but at the same time you can't do that with everything. Could be a good rule of thumb that if you've challenged a bunch of things and the opponent's played it correctly each time, they're probably not trying to mess you about. Next up, and far less borderline, is perhaps the cardinal sin of Warhammer 40k in weighted dice. While rules errors can be a bit of a grey area, there's pretty much little else that signals that you're just going out to be a terrible person, like going to the trouble of getting dice that don't roll properly. Either having picked up some sort of dodgy trick dice off the internet somewhere. I've certainly heard stories of people microwaving or putting dice in the oven, just to weight them a little bit so the 6 is slightly more likely to roll on the top side. And there's certainly been a few high-profile cases at events which always seem to cause a bit of a stir on the internet whenever they're caught. I remember one example when there were dice on 6s on every side caught on a stream on one event, or perhaps the single biggest meme of Warhammer cheating with a person who decided to try and flush their weighted dice down the toilet, but as you can see by the photo, they weren't very successful. Obviously, weighted dice are about as bad cheating as you can get in Warhammer 40k. The game needs the dice as basically a random number generator and probability to function, and just having a few key rolls guaranteed to go your way occasionally could be massive. Perhaps for things like certain big shooting attacks, results where you need an improbable save to keep a model alive for one more turn, or any game rolls that might influence the mission in some way. Otherwise, rather than going through the unpleasant forethought of actually crafting unfair dice, there's still definitely other ways to cheat with dice. Maybe a slightly notorious one might be to roll a dice behind ruins or other terrain on the board and then claim it was something else, basically taking advantage of trusting opponents, or one who's distracted by doing something else rather than paying attention to literally every dice throw that the opponent makes, and could be very easily missed if the throw was exaggerated in the opponent's favour. I remember an example of that a few years back that was caught on a tournament stream, with one player rolling to revive a bunch of poxwalkers, the opponent clearly not seeing the dice, but they were visible on camera, and then claiming that they'd got back 4 of them when they had 2, or something similar to that. Another one that I've seen in person a couple of times is having an important shooting attack, rolling a bunch of dice for it. Maybe you might have a blast attack with a random number of shots, roll the dice to hit, and then just pick up 1 extra dice compared with what you hit with, and go on to make the wound roll. Again, it's one of those things that if it happens any one time, then it very much likely is just a random mistake. But if the player goes on to do the exact same thing every second time they roll a big shooting attack, it again becomes far more obvious. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain, who have featured a couple of times on the channel recently. There's a ton of systems out there for getting nice looking terrain on the tabletop. Different ones might appeal to different people, and the Titans Terrain one is a rather interesting option. It basically is a system of pop-up folded cardboard terrain. You basically have 12 tiles that make up a 45 by 60 inch battlefield, so big enough for Warhammer 40k. Each tile unfolds to make a little building or other bit of scenery. So you can basically have a literally pop-up battlefield that stores completely flat inside a box the size of a regular board game, so it's super easy to transport from place to place if you want some terrain on the move but don't have enough room to transport a whole bunch of plastic ruins around or similar. It won't be the right choice for everyone's purposes, though I think it does have some real selling points. It's far cheaper than Games Workshop terrain, it's very portable, and you don't need to do any hobby work to have a good looking battlefield straight away. They certainly seem to have been pretty popular when I've mentioned them before on the channel. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this video. There'll be links down in the video description if you want to check out their range, and I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk a few more pros and cons, and look through a few more of their specific offerings. Getting back to potential bad behaviour in Warhammer 40k though, another at least potential point that people could cheat on would be to having incorrect army list providers, usually basically amounting to taking more units than you paid the points for. As again, like most everything in 40k, there's a little bit of trust involved here. Most people aren't going to sit and add up all the units in their opponent's army list and double check their math on the points. I think that should come across a bit on the paranoid side to most people. For going over points limits, I've heard a couple of occasional stories about maybe taking another smaller support unit or 2 that they hadn't paid the cost for. That'd be the sort of thing that people might easily miss, particularly when they're focused on the big threats of an enemy army and dealing with them. But there also could be a bunch of more subtle things going on, maybe things like having a character that can't actually attach to a different squad. The list is clearly constructed as if they can, or perhaps doing something like not properly declaring all the war gear on an army list and cracking out anti-tank weapons if you happen to be playing knights, or a bunch of anti-infantry things if you happen to be playing against infantry. Maybe that touches a little bit on list tailoring, which is perhaps more of a question for sportsmanship than cheating though, depending on the context. One perhaps slightly more recent term that I've heard discussed a bit more in the last few years than earlier in 40k is angle shooting. Again, this one's probably on the borderline between cheating versus sportsmanship, and tends to maybe more involve abuse of the rules system and maybe the opposite of playing by intent, and perhaps with an element of being over litigious when it suits them. Some tournaments and event packs specifically have provisions for things like this, and it might be easier to do by examples. A few that I saw discussed on Reddit a while back included things like asking a player to look up and produce every single rule that they use, and if they can't find it, adamantly refuse to play the rule that way. Being deceptive when you're asked questions, such as saying, "Can you attack me if I move you here?" Declaring that you can't, but then using a stratagem to get some extra movement so you can. Just willfully trying to misread rules and claim things that are absolutely 100% clear aren't intended, and maybe be the reason why Games Workshop issues a whole bunch of completely obvious FAQs. Punishing minor sequencing errors, such as say a player puts down a reserves unit, before they've done their movement phase, and then claiming that you can't do the rest of your movement phase. Again, that was another somewhat well discussed and high profile tournament case. Or again, perhaps punishing someone who maybe has the tiniest spike of one of their models sticking out of terrain, when it was very clear that the intent was to hide them and they easily could have, but because a literal millimetre of one spike on one model has been slightly carelessly positioned, just punishing them by firing your entire army and maybe winning the whole game as a result. Again, maybe a bit more of an overlap between good sportsmanship versus cheating, but between a bunch of these edge case things, you could certainly do a lot to bully or gain advantages over a more mild-mannered player who's not trying to gain dodgy advantages over their opponent at literally every turn. Next up, we've got incorrect measurement and movement of models, where generally just playing a bit sloppily and clumsily can give big advantages if the player's being over-generous with their own movement ranges. Maybe the single most classic example being this one, where you measure from the front of the model and then place the back of it where the measurement is, basically gaining you the entire length of the model's base. That one can often be just an honest mistake of newer players though. Maybe more common are people just giving themselves over-generous distances whenever they measure movement. Maybe going an extra 1 inches or 2 inches with every single model on the tabletop might not matter that much in any one situation, but over the course of the game that can add up to a ridiculous amount of extra value. It's often hard to say for the next turn or so. Sometimes it could make no difference, sometimes it could literally be the thing that makes the difference between a passed or failed game-changing charge. And the same could apply to guns at short ranges as well, maybe whether or not your multi-melters get in range of a dreadnought, or just manage to fall short. Another easily done one is cutting the corners of ruins. If your model's not pivoting, then basically the entire back of the base needs to go all the way around the outside of it for things that can't just ghost through. And it can certainly add on a lot of distance to say something like a big bulky tank or monster. And I guess just not bothering to pay pivot or remember it's a thing is technically going to be wrong these days, even if I'm sure there'll be plenty of people out there still playing 10th movement rules as they released. In general, I think getting movement right really is pretty important though. It's definitely fairly bad form to be just overestimating your movements at every turn, and if it starts happening early in the game, it's probably worth calling attention to it earlier on. The player might just not be aware of it, or being a bit over-eager. Better just to say something politely early, as opposed to let it sit and bother you all game long until it comes up to be something really crucial, as it's hard to do take-backs after, say, several movements and charges have happened. Next up, we've got modelling for advantage. I think in general this one tends to be really quite high in people's consciousness, generally fairly fixated on using the right base size and the model height for things that they're moving around the board, and if you're not doing so in such a way that gives you a significant advantage, it tends to be fairly clear. Just in general though, it's the idea that if you had, say, a big leader character with an aura ability, putting him on an enormous sized base would increase the value of that ability, which occasionally could happen from time to time, particularly with people wanting to, say, mount a character on a scenic base. Sometimes people's creations don't perfectly align with what Games Workshop supplied them with. It could also go the other way as well, with using smaller bases than you're supposed to. Say, for example, a sort of Games Workshop created example of that might be when Orc Boys went from 25mm bases up to 32s. It means that if you still use the 25mm bases, you're at a fairly significant advantage in getting more boys into melee than the current ones that Games Workshop sells with the new bases. Just more models are going to be able to fit into close combat. I feel like in reality it might often have a bit less impact than people think, but maybe the key thing is that if you're mounting things on different size bases, or if you have them there because of legacy, you just need to make sure that you aren't gaining advantages from that. Perhaps making sure that 25mm bases are strung out in loose formation and not trying to pack into a ridiculously small space. Or you know how far a character's aura should extend if you account for the extra distance on the base that you've gained. Maybe other more obvious ones are unit profiles and whether or not you're using a taller or shorter model than the one that Games Workshop provides. Say for example, it's easier to hide a model that's lying down or in a really crouched, hunched over position compared with one that's standing up tall as it's supposed to be assembled. Or perhaps the other way around, where you might be able to get some more direct line of sight if your model's super tall or has a much wider profile with which to draw line of sight. Again, I still say that different size models can be made to work, but again just needs to be made sure that you know, say, how high a model should be and have it easy to reference somehow, as sometimes it might not always be obvious when you're in the midst of the battle thinking about all sorts of other things. Another one that's maybe a little bit more of an unusual form of cheating that comes up from time to time in events and things is slow play. The idea of this one is to basically have a game that doesn't reach its natural conclusion, and players have to tot up score sometime in the middle, where in reality a lot of things were in the balance, and often just certain styles of armies are going to be the type that tend to do better in the early game, and could easily win overall if you never have chance to play the last few turns, which could be super important for your opponent to score on. Maybe the classic example will be something like a massive horde of, say, 250 models or so, spend the first few turns very painfully and slowly moving everything onto the mid-board objectives, sweep up all the primary points, and get loads of secondaries for the first few turns, while your opponent struggles to clear the models with the sheer amount of damage output needed. And then if you happen to run out of time early turn 3, the player who's doing the slow playing is very likely to be ahead. In general, people tend to be a bit more savvy to this these days than a while back, I think. Big events and tournaments tend to make good use of chess clocks. I'd say this reduces, but maybe doesn't necessarily eliminate the problem, given that there's still issues with how that they can be used and abused. But in general, due to this sort of thing, I wouldn't be drawing too many conclusions as to which player actually won or lost the game if he didn't get to finish it. Lots of things are pretty critical in the last few turns, and perhaps even more so in 10th edition with things like secret missions on the go. If an army is planning to use one of those, then you kind of need to get to turn 5 to work out whether or not it has happened. For tournaments and things, the general advice tends to be to just raise this early with a tournament organiser, as you need to do it early in the game when there's still some time left, as there's little that you can do about it when the game's reached its entire conclusion, so it needs to be flagged at least somewhat early. Another potentially powerful way to cheat could be incorrect scorekeeping. As with most of these, it could easily be done unintentionally, particularly with certain primary and secondaries sometimes being scored at unusual times, some at the end of the command phase, maybe some at the end of the turn, or the end of the battle round overall. I guess the danger would be that if someone's going out of their way to cheat and they're the only one keeping score, there'd just be a bit of scope for being a little bit lax about remembering to score the opponent's points each turn. I'm sure any drastic swings would be missed easily, but I can just imagine people who are just maybe playing a little bit on the less polite side might just be a little bit more diligent in making sure that they score literally every single victory point that they're entitled to, and not have quite the same sort of fine-tooth comb for their opponent. As a result, I think most of the time, unless you're playing very chilled games or with people who you absolutely know aren't going to mess around, it might just be worth having both players engaging with the scorekeeping and looking at the scores at the end of each turn or round, or both players keeping track simultaneously. I do quite like doing that when playing events and tournaments, as it also just gives you an idea as to where the score's headed at the moment, and whether or not it's a close game where you really need to be eking out every single secondary point, or if say someone's already maxed primary or something like that. As well as dodgy dice and things, with another sort of random mechanic in the game, and a game entirely focused around a mission deck, I guess there's the potential for things like dodgy cards. Again, something that you'd have to be pretty sad to do to deliberately go out to mess around with them, but also something that does seem like maybe a potential weakness in Warhammer 40k for ensuring fair play. It just would be very hard to catch someone leaving out, say, a single bad tactical objective when they're playing missions and just not having it present in their deck, or peeking at the next tactical objective card when their opponent's gone to the loo to get a drink or something. Again though, like with weighted dice, I feel like this is quite so direct cheating that you're going to very rarely see people actually go and do it. And of course it wouldn't work at all if you were using something like the Tabletop Battles app and say using that to draw objectives. Again, maybe sort of a halfway between cheating and poor sportsmanship, basically tilting the general rules of the game that you're playing in some way to favour your army could be kind of unpleasant in a few ways. Maybe one obvious way of that could be things like choosing the table that you're playing on in terms of the terrain. Again, something that can be kind of subjective, and you certainly can play with boards that have either more or less terrain, even if you do basically need at least a good amount of line of sight blocking stuff. If people are either consciously or subconsciously tailoring that to how their army would like to play, perhaps making sure that they're going in with the single heaviest city fight board ever if they happen to be playing a melee army, or going with a barren open wasteland if they're playing a gun line. It definitely can be one of the factors that could destabilise a game in 40k and give you a big advantage to one player or the other. In my experience though, I definitely feel like this happens a lot more accidentally than it does on purpose. I've certainly had games where it's just not been super obvious that actually the terrain that you're playing on really isn't that great for blocking line of sight, or we've created some incredibly powerful firing lanes, to the point where an opponent's going to struggle to hide their advance up the board. While on the subject of poor sportsmanship though, even though I wanted to talk mainly about cheating for this one, I think the line is at least a little bit blurred, and often poor sportsmanship can actually be worse than certain mild forms of cheating. The game of Warhammer in general is just kind of dependent on it. Perhaps things like heavy list tailoring, so taking a hard counter to the opponent's list that they've got no hope to win against, maybe excessive use of gotchas, trying to keep information hidden as possible until they can spring trap cards, or not playing much of an open game where you basically refuse to tell abilities of your units until it's too late. Maybe poorly proxied models that are really confusing that you can't tell what you're playing against. I feel like for almost all of the examples here, just a bit of sloppy play with, say, measuring distances, not bothering to check important negatives of rules, or other similar things like that might not necessarily be deliberate cheating, but still could amount to a few of the same outcomes, and just be annoying for the opponent if they have to keep correcting things. In any case though, I think I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know which of these you've seen in the wild down in the comments, and how common it is for you to experience some form of cheating or extremely bad sportsmanship like this in your own games of 40k out there. As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. Finally, before I leave off, I'll just cycle back to Titan's Terrain in the video sponsor. As mentioned earlier, the system of folding terrain with a bunch of boards that make up one big battlefield, and could be a solid option for terrain for a bunch of folks out there. As ever, with different 40k terrain pieces, there's certainly pros and cons. The advantages of the Titan's terrain system is that it's really quite easy to store and transport, as it all literally folds flat, which you can't say of most terrain out there, so it can fit in these board game style boxes. So pretty easy to store and transport if that's an issue for you. It's also far cheaper of Games Workshop terrain, though you can say that of most things really. A full table of Games Workshop plastic would probably cost you several times more, and the Titan's terrain is at least somewhat similar to MDF or certain plastic or 3D printed components out there. Perhaps the other major advantage is that unlike most of the rest, you don't need any sort of painting or assembly. It's all ready to go absolutely immediately, which definitely is a factor for a bunch of people who want to focus their hobby time for their playing pieces as opposed to the game board itself. For a few common criticisms though, it is a little bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF. It's made of at least fairly sturdy cardboard, but cardboard nonetheless and designed to fold flat, and that does mean that you might need to take a bit more care of it, and it can be hard to position some models in the upper floors of the ruins and things, as they're a bit less sturdy than some. Maybe one of the other bigger downsides is that the grid layout system can be a bit less flexible than some, and while you can certainly make a bit of variety by shifting around the squares, it's not going to be quite as freeform as having freestanding bits of terrain. It might make a few firing lanes for a 40k battlefield, and it might not be the worst idea to just maybe supplement it with maybe a couple of other freestanding bits, perhaps placed on top of tiles and things. It obviously won't make things like tournament approved layouts and things if that's what you're looking for, but I think for the most part can be a good option for plenty of people's battlefields. Fairly quick, easy to use, and has all of its storage advantages. For the actual sets they have, they've got a Forgotten Furnace one, which is sort of like a Chaos Foundry. Their standard sets are priced at £112, $140 or €130. That gets you the tiles that you can see here, basically 10 pop-up building ones and a couple of blank ones, with a bunch of ruins and furnaces and glowing runes and things. There's then a more standard Ruined City one in the Shattered Hive. Plenty of bombed out concrete buildings, armoured transport containers, and generally fit the vibe of perhaps the standard cookie cutter 40k battlefield well enough. And then there's an overgrown capital one, a sort of ruined verdant city. This one could be a bit more applicable to both 40k and fantasy type settings, with fewer future themed bits about. Then each of the previous also has an expansion set for a big centrepiece. These ones take up 2 tiles and make one great big building. There's a cathedral and a reliquary for the capital and the hive sets, and then a great big infernal spire for the foundry. In any case though, feel free to check them out, linked in the video description, and of course a big thank you to Titan's Terrain for sponsoring the video and helping support the content on Auspex Tactics. In any case though, I'll leave it there for this one. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more videos like this. I do tend to post 40k things just about every day. And finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can support that if you'd like to down in the video description. There's also discount links for various Warhammer retailers around the world and a bunch of other stuff, so a massive thank you to anyone supporting or using those. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.